Hello everybody, it's Foxy speaking and welcome to an episode of Foxy's Fun Inspirational Chats, and today I will be your host. This is a story about a cheeky Maine Coon cat. It was a male Maine Coon cat and his name is Keith. Keith, the Maine Coon with a cheeky trait. Well, Keith, who was quite a large parched Maine Coon cat, who had black fur with a big long fluffy tail and fluffy fur. He was a black Maine Coon, but of course, like the black cat, but obviously bigger and fluffier. He was quite a big boy, as he pretty much, whenever he sat on his owner's lap, he covered, his whole body just covered their laps. He was also affectionate, but did have a trait which was rather cheeky. Sometimes, whenever Keith's owners had made a special meal, and if they were not in the room and had to get something, he would just know where the food was. So, big fluffy tail went up into the air, he'd scamper, jump onto the worktop, and then just start nicking the food by eating it greedily. And before long, his owners, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who are his owners who look after him and own him, or have ownership within Keith himself, they would always catch Keith eating the food greedily if they had to go somewhere. "Keith," they would say, and then they'd pick him up and put him on the floor, and then they'd have to do something with the food. Sometimes, one of the most cheekiest traits Keith has is if there was food on the plate, and if there was no one to eat it, he would just know it was there, go onto the table, and then swipe the food by just eating it up. Sometimes he would get through half a plate full of food once his owners catch him. And then obviously they would say, "Keith, you greedy boy," and then, "Greedy, greedy boy, Keith," and then pick him up and put him on the floor. So Keith himself had quite a cheeky trait, being a Maine Coon, well, part Maine Coon himself. Sometimes Keith would wake up his owners in the middle of the night, and then once they'd wake up, he'd just start licking them, and they'd say, "Oh, Keith," says Mr. or Mrs. Smith if Keith wakes either one of them up in the night. He said, It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, Keith. It's time to go to sleep." And then they just go to sleep. And then big fluffy tail goes up in the air, and then he starts licking either Mr. or Mrs. Keith in the ear, in one of their ears, if they would not give in to what he wanted. And then once he'd licked them in the ear, it was a sudden waking up from either Mr. or Mrs. Smith, and they say, and then they just give him some affection and the attention he wants that way. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were going to go on holiday one day. So they had to hire a cat sitter. Luckily, they had a cat sitter who came over. The cat sitter came over. "Hello," said the cat sitter to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. "Hello," Mr. and Mrs. Smith said in their friendly return to the cat sitter. "Am I here to look after Keith, your Maine Coon?" asked the cat sitter. "Yes," said Mr. Smith, "that is true. Keith is our beautiful black Maine Coon." There, Keith overheard Mr. and Mrs. Smith's conversation with the cat sitter. So, trundling slowly forward to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Keith walks up to see the cat sitter. The cat sitter, she looked at Keith and then she was like, oh, isn't Keith just a beautiful boy? She said as she crouched down to him and picked him up and then began to give him a cuddle, leaning him by her chest and stroking him as she gave him a cuddle. Keith ended up looking at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, just smiling happily at him as the cat sitter began to tightly embrace the Maine Coon, giving him a cuddle. Then she put him down again, and then standing up on the floor, he just turned round and looked up at Mr. and Mrs. Smith. "Goodbye, beautiful boy. Goodbye, handsome boy," said Mrs. Smith as she started stroking him on his head. "We will see you in about a week. We will see you in a week's time," said Mr. Smith. So they picked up their suitcases and walked to their car because they had to go to the airport. Keith followed the cat sitter into the house and she began her cat sitting duty. She put on the television and began watching the Pink Panther cartoon. As she was watching television, Keith just sat on the dining room table and overlooked the garden, as their dining room, where Mr. and Mrs. Smith generally eat together, their dining room is basically close to their garden. Keith was just watching and watching and watching to see if anything could happen outside in the garden. Watching attentively, looking directly towards the window, and then at the same time occasionally peeping down to his cat flap. He would check and would check, but there was nothing to see. As the television went raving on, with the cat sitter watching the Pink Panther cartoon, Keith, the Maine Coon Keith, just sat almost bored, waiting for some action. Upon waiting and waiting, suddenly he saw something. He saw that a cat was stuck. He saw it and he knew exactly what to do. Once seeing the cat was in trouble, he pounced off the dining room table and went and scurried through his cat flap. He began racing across the lawn of the garden and then came to the scene where the cat was. He came to the cat and pulled the cat out, who got his head stuck in a hole in the garden fence. Then Keith began to lead where the cat should have gone, rather than trying to rush through a hole and getting his head stuck in the fence hole. Keith led the cat to the appropriate direction. The cat, who actually turned out to be a female cat, thanked him and just licked him on the nose. Licked him on the nose as a sign of thanks and jumped over the fence to head back home. Keith felt proud. Keith may be a mischievous part Maine Coon cat, but he could certainly be a hero, and believe this or not, the cat sitter, despite having watched the television, had seen everything, and she was amazed by Keith and his heroism towards the female cat who got her head stuck in the hole in the fence. 1 week had passed. Eventually the hole got fixed by the next door neighbours in the fence, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith's holiday was over. And then the cat sitter told Mr. and Mrs. Smith about everything, told Mr. and Mrs. Smith all about Keith's heroism saving another cat from being stuck. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were just so proud of the news they decided to get Keith an award. The cat sitter had subsequently left, but as a big present, as a big rewarding present, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, for Keith's heroism for the cat he saved from being stuck in the fence hole, now fixed up, for his heroism of actions, they gave him a nice delicious fish for his supper. This made Keith very happy, and began eating the delicious fish Mr. and Mrs. Smith had cooked and bought for him in the deepest and greatest of satisfaction. He may have been a mischievous cat, or he may have a mischievous trait, but he is certainly a hero for a cat. The end. Well, thanks all indeed for watching, everybody. Please let me know what your thoughts were on this story in the comments down below. Thanks so much indeed for watching, and I shall certainly see you in the very next video. Ta-ta, another time everybody. From Foxy.